Well, then I can call this meeting to order at 5:31 p.m. We'll move to roll call, and you said Greg will not be here, and Sean is running late. Other than that, let's see, Stephanie is here, Joffrey, Fung, or Sapphire, Naif, Rehan, and Andrea, and I think that's everyone.
I think the only ones we're missing besides Greg and Sean are Bjorn and
Okay.
Judy.
Okay, Bjorn and Judy are not here. And then, so we'll move on to the agenda approval if everyone,
There's a slight amendment to the agenda because I forgot when I was putting on there. There is not communications received from homecoming. I forgot to pull that one off on there. So if we can make that slight adjustment.
Do we need to vote on the amendment to the agenda?
I mean, there hasn't been a motion yet, so it'd really just be a motion to approve as recommended.
Okay, so can I entertain a motion to approve as recommended then? Okay, if anyone would like to motion. Okay, Joffrey motions. Any second?
I second.
Okay, Stephanie seconds. So do we do any discussion on this?
I don't think with this one, I think we can just, unless there's any, I think we can just move straight to a vote.
Okay, all in favor to amend the agenda by striking homecoming and other business? All those in favor? Not sure what Fung's vote is or Rehan's, but
Rehan has a hand. It looks like they put their hands up in favor. Yeah.
okay. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. 1, 2, 3, 6.
Looks like
okay.
Yep, 6 yeah.
Okay. So now we will move to the agenda approval.
That was, we just motioned to approve it as, yep, so now we're onto the minutes.
So now we'll move to the approval of the minutes. Can I entertain a motion? Joffrey, any second?
Okay. I second.
I think Naif seconded it first. So Joffrey motions, Naif seconds that motion, and any discussion on the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving last week's minutes?
Show of hands if you're approving.
Show your hands of approval for the minutes last week, please.
There you go. Looks like all are in favor, Deanna.
Okay. No opposed, no abstentions. Motion passes 6-0. Now we will move to reports. I have no reports, so we can move to advisor reports.
I do not have any reports, but I do have a few things later in the agenda, so I'll just save it for them.
My only report is just an update and a reminder. We do not meet next week due to the holiday. And so our next meeting, which will be our last one for the quarter, will be 2 weeks from today, December 1st. And then we'll break and come back the first week in January. So.
Any reports, Joffrey?
I don't know whether this one aligns with this, but it's pretty much the S&A annual report is up and coming pretty well with every officer. So we spent the whole of last week working on it, and it's coming. I mean, it's progressing pretty well.
I guess I will add in there. Thank you, Joffrey, for reminding me. I did send out a reminder to all the units. We've already received a good number of the annual reports for last fiscal year. They're due December 1st, which is when our next meeting is. And so I can give at least a brief update at our next meeting on where we're at. I sent out a reminder today just as a 2-week, hey, reminder to get these in so people have a little bit of a heads up with the holiday, but they're coming in.
Okay, thank you, Joey and Joffrey. We'll move to other business, and I don't believe there's other business, so we'll move to first call for public comment, if anyone has any public comment. And seeing none, we can move to new business, which is the base funding adjustment recommendation.
Thank you, Deanna. So as we have been talking about all quarter, we have been talking about the base funded areas and what we need to do financially to adhere to some of the RCWs and policies that we've referenced in previous meetings. So I won't go over all of that information since that was a lot, but I do have an official recommendation for fiscal 22 of the funding cycle, and then also fiscal 23, 24, and 25. So I'm going to share my screen briefly so we can actually have some kind of number context a little bit. So bear with me. Can everybody see this okay? Okay. So, and I can send this out to the committee. So as a reminder, this is really just the presentation of the recommendation, and the committee will deliberate and vote, not next week because we don't have a meeting, but it would be the week after that. So our next meeting would be the deliberation on this. But essentially, this is the financial overview of the S&A fee. And so like we have said, we did not necessarily, our anticipated enrollment number was a little lower than what we had thought it was going to be when we set the S&A allocations. And so the recommendation that we have for you today is to reduce the S&A allocation for fiscal 22 by 5%. And then for the remaining 3 years of the funding cycle, we would reduce the allocation 10%. So as you can kind of see in this target, this gives a dollar figure, not a percentage. And so for fiscal 22, what that dollar figure looks like is $372,500. And then the remaining years would be $745,000 each year. So to give a little bit of context, what that means is when we are tying it to our debt service ratio coverage, which is kind of going back to our training here, is that doesn't necessarily bring us down to zero, which you would kind of think that that would be some of the goal. But really what, Joey and I and the administration were trying to accommodate this situation is to be able to provide the student services with the least amount of impact on the finances. And this is where this target sits. So what that means is that we are recommending a 5% reduction, but we're still going to be using our reserves to offset some of the other deficits that we are going to absorb with the potential enrollment. And I think it's easier to kind of visualize it through the graph. And so as you'll see in this graph, this is our plan. So even with the 5% reduction along with the 10% reduction each following year, we still plan on eating up about half of our reserves, which I would say financially is something that we can capably do. As a reminder, per our policy and procedure, the S&A guidelines, we have to have at least $500,000 in our reserve account. And so if we go through with this recommendation, this would end our fund balance at about $3 million at the end of the funding cycle. So we would still be in compliant with our policy if we did choose to approve this recommendation. So the other piece that will follow with this document is a list of all of our base funded areas. And so it's kind of loading a little slow, but I'm going to try to scroll up a little bit. And again, I know this is a lot of information, so just know that I will email this out to the committee so you can review it in a little bit more detail. But what this is showing is that this is showing the fiscal 21 allocation for each funded department, fiscal 22 requested, fiscal 22 approved. And so what this means is this is the allocation that the Board of Trustees approved. And the fiscal 22 is showing the reduction. And then in fiscal 23 and 25, it shows the other reduction. So it's kind of like a summarized version of the financial report on page 2. And the reason why I bring this up is because we just see that there's a reduction right at the top. And so we just see that dollar figure. And the reason why I'm showing that is it ties into kind of what I described in our last meeting, is that when we go through this university-wide with budget adjustments, is those are usually handled at the vice president level. And so that would be at the divisional level. And so what that means is that there is primarily 2 divisions that are funded, that have funding within the S&A fund. And so that would be academic and student life. So that would be ASL. And then it would also be the business side. So the BFA division. And so essentially what it means is that the CFO and the provost would be the ones that usually handle where those adjustments might fall. So that is why you don't see it per area. You will just see an actual dollar figure at the top. And so to kind of scroll down, I also did include the defunded S&A programs at the bottom. So this is kind of tying to our base funding document that we submitted to the Board of Trustees last year. So this is just kind of tying it in to give kind of a picture. So this is showing that the allocation was initially approved at 7.4. And the recommendation follows for fiscal 22 for about just a flat 7 million. And in the following years after that, it will be 6.7. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can here for a second. There it is. There we go. Just in case, because I'd like to open it up for any kind of questions on this presentation or recommendation.
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, Lacey, but just to be clear for the committee, I know we went over this at training, but just as a reminder that really when you were looking at that chart of how much we're eating into the reserve, that part of the work that we were doing is looking at how much we could eat into that would be sustainable. And so we're eating into it. You saw the graph on there. We're estimating about $1 million each year. And really that was the most that we were able to work that the rest of the university system could absorb that would keep us in a positive debt service ratio. Is that correct? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, that is correct. So to kind of reiterate that, what that means is that's about as much as we can take financially for these years. And so we can't really go more than that, if that makes sense. The other piece that I wanted to add in that I think we've touched base quite a bit, but I do want to add it into the recommendation, is that the recommendation is for the entire funding cycle. So it includes fiscal 22, 23, 24, 25, but we will as a committee review this every single year. So in next fall, we will ensure and run the same type of financial data and actually just double check to make sure that our enrollment numbers are what we are targeting. And so we will still go through this process each year, but the recommendation is for the entire funding cycle.
And so what that really means is if things are on target with what we're projecting, there's no need for the committee next year, those other years, to make additional adjustments. If we, in a great scenario, right, if we get a huge boost in enrollment, that means the committee has the ability to adjust and lower that down, so that way more that funding comes in. So we're setting it this way so it gets the standard for the rest of the quadrennial funding, but knowing that with the budget situation we're in, we're going to be looking at it every year. So each of the committee years, we'll look at it first thing fall.
Lacey, if you can share that screen again, I think I would appreciate it, because there's a part I didn't understand. And when you're going through the numbers, can you maybe share it again so I can, show you where I didn't understand?
Jeffrey, was it at this part?
No, the first page actually.
This first page? Okay.
Right, up top. Yeah, and so the proposed allocation and then the fiscal and then the annual one. It looks like the numbers aren't changing. Can you maybe like explain that again?
Yes, I can. And so what this means is that at some point, these areas below this red font right here will be adjusted. But, oh, sorry about that. It is selected all of that. But that target, and I'm going to just pick on fiscal 22 for a second. So that 372,000 will need to be adjusted somewhere in below those areas. And that is where I was talking about, where that adjustment will take place at the vice president level. So for the majority of it is going to be at the provost, and then there is some in the financial side of the house. So that would be under the CFO. So we have two vice presidents that are kind of involved in this process. And what it means is that they will work on that. Essentially, as soon as the recommendation comes through from the S&A committee, that really is what kind of pings the vice presidents, and they will figure out within their areas where that target can be absorbed. And so it's not necessarily across the board. It's going to be something that is decided at that level of the administration.
Does that mean all the areas will be affected, or some areas will be affected?
It's kind of hard to say because it is up to them. What I would say is normally what will happen is they will try to take that target and absorb it in current vacancies, in current areas that could potentially, handle maybe a reduction in whatever their goods and services could be. And so they'll look at different things, and a lot of it's going to be probably with a vacancy. Okay. And so to explain what a vacancy is so we fund areas throughout that whole list that have professional staff. And if that professional staff moves on to a different job, that salary savings is what we call it. And that's also termed as a vacancy. So in certain cases, sometimes that is absorbed in the target. And what it could mean is that position could be vacant for 3 or 4 or 5 months, depending on what the scenario is and depending on the position. So it gets pretty complicated. And I just want to make sure that I'm being clear that that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the vice presidents will do, but they will evaluate each area, they will talk to each program, and they will make the decisions based off of those different program needs. And what is complex about S&A is the needs for each program are so different. And so it will be essentially worked through for each program all the way up to the VP, and then figured out before the end of the fiscal year.
My second question is, seems like the first year is 5%, and then the second year is 10%. Why the 200% increase, if I may say? It could have been 7.5 or so. Why 10%?
Well, I think that's a good question. I would go and say the 10% is pretty much the lowest we could go.
Okay. So
we could have potentially gone higher than that, but in order to make sure that we are adhering to our debt service a ratio,
yeah,
and making that target, that was the lowest number that we could go. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does by how much does it, if say, the 10%, at what level does it put the debt ratio?
At what level? So our target is going to be 1.0. And
Okay.
so that's where we achieve. So that's kind of where we back it up. So we say, okay, we're going to achieve 1.0, and that's the ratio number. And that is what is required by us as a university.
So the 10% puts it at 1.0. And then the next fiscal year, the 5% puts it at 10.0. Then the next one puts it, 5% put it at 1.0. And then next one, 10% put it at 1.0, and that's how they came up with the 10%, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's the piece that we'll evaluate each year, is to ensure that that 10%. So for fiscal 22, it's going to be the 5%. And then we'll come back next fall and just reevaluate to ensure that our fall enrollment number is within our target and that we can achieve that within that 10% reduction.
Is there any other option that had been brainstormed beside the reduction?
Well, I mean, I would say there was a lot of different options on the table. But unfortunately, with the enrollment decline, at the end of the day, the answer is going to be that there is going to have to be a reduction. And dollar figure wise, this is where we're sitting, to be as mindful as we possibly can for the student experience, and also for the financial obligations that we have as a university. So I don't know, Greg, if you wanted to provide kind of any insight on that.
Yeah, so what's important, I think, to keep in mind is we're down roughly 2,000 students enrollment wise, and that's 2,000 students that paid into this funding pool that are no longer there to pay into the pool. So the revenue coming in is less than it historically has been, and we allocated kind of last year's S&A allocated kind of beyond what we were projecting enrollment to be. So we have to make some adjustment. We had talked about a 10% adjustment this year, but we're sitting in November, and to do a 10% adjustment to programs that have already been allocated base funding for the year would have been challenging for many of the programs to meet. 5% makes it a little more palatable to begin to look at what 5% might look like this year and then plan for the 10% next year. Keep in mind, 10% right now is a pretty magical number.
Right.
That's predicated on stabilizing enrollment and slow growth over the course of the next 3 to 4 years of maybe 100 students each year. It's going to take probably 5 to 10 years to rebuild that enrollment of 2,000 students that we've lost. And that comes back slowly, and we achieve that, 100, 200 students every year. We achieve that with new students, and we also achieve that with retaining students that are currently here. So we've got some work to do outside of this to stabilize enrollment in order to operationalize the model that's in front of you. If we can't do that, that 10%, maybe 12%, maybe 15%, that's all going to be predicated on next year's enrollment numbers. And we'll have to benchmark that each year for the number of students that pay into this pool. So I think it's a realistic model at 10%, but it's also still a pretty conservative model at 10%. And I think, that our recommendation to this group is, let's try and be conservative. If we grow 500 students, that's great. It means there's more money in the pool, and we have to ask those departments to take less of a reduction than that 10%. But that'll be determined on a year-by-year basis, I think, is the best way to do it, conservatively.
Okay.
When I think with what Greg said, that goes back to what Lacey said, is that this recommendation is the one that is the least impactful financially that we could do to hit the debt service ratio, but also try and still ensure that the S&A allocation is meeting those programming targets, the service and activities that were intended from this base funding. And so trying to ensure that students are still getting access to those services with as least of an impact as possible is really where it is, as Greg said, probably a conservative estimate of what we're doing. The other part I do want to make sure is clear for you all, and this is more because this is a recording and I know people are going to go back and watch this, is when we're talking about the reduction, the 5% for the remainder of this year and the 10%, that's a reduction in the allocation that goes out, but also because of the debt service ratio, it's a reduction in their expenses, which is less from your all's in, but more for those out there, is that means they have to make sure they're sticking within their budget. And the process really is, we're going to make whatever recommendation. You all will vote on this at the next meeting in 2 weeks. This then goes up to the administration, to our CFO, to review and look at. And then if he is in agreement at the administrative level, then it actually goes to the Board of Trustees for final review and approval. Because again, all these pieces with S&A ultimately go up to the Board of Trustees. So that's the other part of the timing of this is the Board of Trustees does not meet super frequently. And so this would be on their winter meeting, meaning that's when this would officially be approved, and then all of the steps start taking effect.
And I would add, maybe to give you some perspective as well. So in student success alone, within that division, we currently have 25 vacant positions. So we're going to realize some salary savings in many of these areas that are S&A funded. We'll look for that to begin to cover some of those percentage adjustments. Many of those positions we plan to replace if it makes sense for us with the number with where our student enrollment is. Some positions we'll choose not to replace, and we'll use that at least this year, next year as an impact on the adjustment to that budget. But again, we want to be able to deliver the programs, services, and facilities that students need to be successful here. So it's going to be a very strategic adjustment that we're going to have to make in each area. Some areas will take a cut and some areas won't. And we'll have to take those within each department and determine how best to do that with the least amount of impact on students.
If those areas are determined by the higher people, allow me for lack of a better term, can they be sent back to S&A for review?
I think knowing both of the individuals, if S&A would like to see or understand the strategy and the impact of their thinking, and when it comes to putting together that list, I think we can make that request. I think they'd be willing to do that. This is, at some level, it's a little bit of uncharted territory for us. And we haven't typically found ourselves here because we've been an institution that's been growing. So we've actually had the opposite problem. Where we've had more money than we needed to budget for. And that explains kind of what has happened with our reserves. In this case, we're moving the other direction. So I think I would imagine that both Joel Clucking and Michelle D'investi would be willing to share, kind of their thinking and their proposed adjustments to this group for review. I think it should be a transparent process.
Yes, I think so too. I think they should come and present to us their line of reasoning and why is the best course of action.
And I would be more than happy to, have that conversation along with Greg with them. In a general sense, it will be transparent normally. So we will have to share that with the committee. So I think once we have the recommendation that flows up, I think we can tie that in there and just have it come through. But at the end of the day, we will, regardless, the committee and myself, we are required to make that public. So it will be a public document once it's all finalized and to that point.
Cool.
When I guess and I apologize if Greg already answered this because Zoom kicked me out right in the middle of your question, Joffrey, is also to be aware that, again, we'll get the responses back from the administration in terms of those individual program adjustments. The part to be aware of is it's really not coming back for us to say yes or no. It's coming back for awareness because, again, those are going to happen and potentially similar to what we're talking, be adjusted annually. Because there could be some programs that can absorb it now because of things like Lacey said, vacancies. And then there may be vacancies in a different area in year 2 that allows a different area to absorb that more. And so that's really why the administration at the divisional level, and this is not just with S&A, as Lacey said, this is how all of the budget process works, where they make those program specific adjustments, knowing here's the dollar figure adjustment you have to make overall. Without eliminating the S&A programs. I think that's the other part to be clear in, is that these adjustments would not lead to the elimination of one of those base funded units. That would be a very different story. Joffrey, if that were to be the case, that would come back to the committee in those scenarios, but that is not the intent or plan, especially with what we're talking about.
Thank you.
So are there any questions? Well, if there are within the next week, because I know after this meeting, I'm sure y'all are going to be transitioning into Thanksgiving week and finals and all of this stuff. So I think you all know how to get a hold of me. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to always reach out. I am more than happy to sit down and kind of talk through it because it is a lot of numbers. But after this meeting, I will be sure to send out that PDF document so you actually have something that's maybe a little bit easier to read than on the Zoom screen. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lacey. If there's no more discussion, then we can move on to old business and voting on suspending supplemental funding from our conversation last week.
And so just as a reminder for the committee, again, we presented last week, the recommendation was that for the remainder of this academic year, that we would suspend supplemental funding, given the whole budget situation we talked about previously and kind of tying off of what Lacey just said. And so really that's the recommendation, the presentation. This is the part that opens it up for you all as the committee members to deliberate amongst yourselves. Again, as you go back to the training where you're saying either why you are agreeing or disagreeing. Again, we don't need to everyone say the same thing. Be mindful of time within it. And if anyone is at a spot, they can say, I motion to, and move forward with that recommendation at that point. So I know this is our first official deliberation, so just as a reminder.
Lacey, can you maybe again present to us the data if you have it still?
Are you, Joffrey, which data are you referencing?
The supplemental from last week. Refresh us on the.
Yeah, so I don't think I have the presentation handy, but as a refresher, the intent behind the S&A supplemental suspension is really tied to almost pretty much the same conversation that had to do with the base funding allocations. And so when we're talking about expenses and reducing expenses, it also includes the supplemental funding. And so if we were to choose to not suspend it, we would have to take a bigger reduction on the S&A allocation, the S&A allocation. And so my recommendation is going to be to suspend the supplemental to be able to better help support the base funded areas, which is one of the main priorities of the S&A guidelines and funding. So when we talk about the funding priorities, we have a few in there, but one of the top ones is our base funded areas. And so that is actually above the supplemental process, which is why I'm tying into suspending the supplementals for this year.
You said we have a few in there. Can you maybe mention them to us, the few that are there?
We do. We have a few requests. I have not processed those until we have made the official recommendation. And so we will get students and departments asking for supplemental. But I think once we explain the situation, I do believe that they will understand. Because anybody that is working on campus right now, we have been dealing with budget adjustments for a couple of years now. And so I think that they would understand why. But to reiterate, the S&A supplemental requests that we have gotten have not officially been approved or processed yet.
Thank you.
Bjorn, so two things, and then I'll have a statement afterwards. Bjorn did put into the chat for you all the PDF of Lacey's financial training that was there. So thank you, Bjorn, for putting that. And then I know you had a comment before I make mine. I just wanted people to see that.
my general thoughts was, well, actually, Joey, you should probably go before me because it was predicated on more information.
I think the only part I was going to say is, and this is probably an oversimplification, but it ties into what we're just talking with the base funding. As Lacey said, the priority for the S&A funds, the fee that we collect, is to continue supporting the base funding units. That's where that is. So that's part of this recommendation because, again, simplifying it, any money that we would allocate out for supplemental is money that we would have to further reduce the base funding adjustments by, in the simplest terms. So what we were just talking about, that 5% and the 10%, that's all money coming out of the base funding. Any supplemental that we would allocate out is gonna also impact that debt service ratio, meaning in order for us to do supplemental means we have to further reduce the base funding units, which is why the recommendation is two parts. One is to not have supplemental, so that way we can offset some of that further reduction to the base funding.
And I just wanted to tie in one of the things that we talked about last week is that if we don't suspend supplemental, there is no way to ensure that base funded areas don't come back and ask. And so if there is a reduction in a program and we do have supplemental, they could just come and request it. And so I think with good nature of the situation that we're in and the financial hardships that we're in, I do think it's a good recommendation to suspend it. And it also gives the committee the ability and the time to review the policies, the procedures, and to do a pretty in-depth and appropriate program review for during winter quarter and spring quarter for our base funded areas.
How long will we be suspending it?
My recommendation would be to suspend it for the entire academic year, which would be for fiscal 22.
I think this would be part of going back to what we said, each year, the committee in the fall will look at where we're at in terms of the budget and in terms of enrollment. And so the idea would be that depending on where we're at, each committee year would be able to make the decision at that level. So this really is for this academic year.
Why suspended? Why not just reduce it by about 50%?
If we do reduce it, we will need to then reevaluate the recommendation for the base funded areas. And so the really thing that I want to harp on is that the primary responsibility of the S&A committee is to ensure that the base funded areas can sustain and operate for the student activities. And so if we then change the priority to supplemental, that would be not necessarily adhering to our policy and procedures for our priority of funding.
Because we're at a spot that if we were to do that, we're actually, and again, I know I'm oversimplifying, but I'm not our financial person, so I can say it this way. We'd have to be taking the money from our base funding to do supplemental. And we're already having to have a conversation about reducing base funding. I think Bjorn has a question or comment.
Yeah, I certainly, it's not an ideal situation. I'm mostly trying to figure out ways that could potentially allow for heavily reduced supplemental allocation, but present supplemental allocation, because I just don't want to hang anybody out to dry, so to speak. Deanna raised the suggestion last meeting of potentially allocating supplemental funds only to base funded areas. I don't know how that would pan out, but it seemed like a thing that could be explored. The other thing I wanted to explore was supplemental funding only for capital requests, as those don't impact the debt service ratio. I may be overestimating the importance of said debt service ratio, but I would also add that capital requests tend to be long-lasting things that can continue to it's like an injection of capital in the simplest terms. Those are just a couple of things that I wanted to explore.
Joey, do you want to go or? Okay, so I would say that the debt service ratio is one of the most important things that we should talk about. We are legally obligated to meet that threshold. And that is our number one priority, is to ensure that we can make our bond payment. The second priority is to ensure that we are appropriately financially trying to take care of our base funded areas. And so going back to the policy and procedure, we are required to do that. So I do want to make sure people understand that the priority of funding is something that I think we should really think about, because if we talk about supplemental, the 90% of the supplemental funds are used for student travel. Student travel has percentage-wise has taken a hit for at least over 50% has been cut down. People are just not traveling. Conferences are virtual. There are other opportunities for students to be able to get the same type of experience, but for reduced cost. So I absolutely understand that the impact of suspending supplemental, it will have an impact. And I'm not going to lie to you, there will be one. But impacting the base funded areas are going to impact every single student that we have. It's going to impact our center students. It's going to impact our Ellensburg students. And so I do want to make sure that when we are thinking about this, that we're thinking about the entire student body and not just the ones that might go on the trip, or, you know, the small population of individuals that could potentially find useful reasons for that supplemental. Now, I do want to say that the capital expenses, I think that is like a very interesting concept to bring up. And it does not impact our debt service ratio if we do have certain capital, but most of the capital pieces that would come through have to be vetted for a very long time. And so as far as I know, I don't have any confirmation that we have any capital projects that are on the docket. Greg, please step in if you know anything else other than that, but I have not heard any of those for at least this fiscal year.
Yeah, not for this current fiscal year or next fiscal year. Now, again, that depends if we have any major breakdowns in facilities or equipment that we're not anticipating or we're not projecting in its life cycle. Most of that we have in a life cycle replacement package that would fit into the operating budget, so that those departments that get capital money resources already have built into their budgets. Not to say that we couldn't have an emergent situation that occurs. In that case, you know, I think we could always approach S&A and say, would you be willing to dip into the reserves a little deeper to support this capital need, because it's a necessary fix on a building or necessary replacement on a piece of equipment. We're in pretty good shape there, I think, for the most part. So.
The parts I was going to add on here is just, and we talked about this last week, but just as a reminder that really the intent of the S&A fee was to provide service and activities, not for supplemental. We have been in a really fortunate spot for over the last decade where we've had the luxury of doing supplemental the way that we have. But for those few of you who were on the committee last year, we made the decision to suspend supplemental with the exception of base funding units due to the financial situation we were in last year. And we are in a even more critical financial situation this year than where we were last year. So I think it's important to know this is not a normal year. This is a financial situation that is unlike anything we've had before. So that's why we're having to look at and recommending taking these steps to ensure the stability of these funds and the stability of these programs. There are impacts to them, but these are the best recommendations we can make that cover all these bases, because it is a complex situation.
So I think that considering the nature of this year, especially with the reiteration of what our advisors have been saying, it would be wise to suspend the supplemental funding, or at least like consider it, especially because what they recommend is probably towards the best outcome for the committee and for the students, especially like what they've said, how S&A, we want to prioritize those base funding areas, especially because they impact the most students. When you think about it, it impacts ASCWU, which impacts a lot of students as well. There's a lot of student support in there. So I think if we don't have any more conversation or input on that, could I, does someone
Looks
have?
like Judy does.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. Just one last thing. I was curious if we can find sort of alternative funding sources. So if we do get requests, we can sort of, instead of just saying no, reroute. And that way there's maybe a potential for that to be funded, maybe not by us, but, in other ways.
I think that is a very good suggestion. Depending on what type of request we have, there could be other avenues. There is a tech fee, there is other options, there's grants, there's all sorts of different things, but it's really case by case. So, but I want to like highlight that a little bit, is that when we do have situations like this, it is something that we try to handle, and some of it probably will be handled by the Dean of Students, which is Greg here. And I don't know, Greg, if you want to maybe kind of, I'm throwing you right in on the spot here, but there are different maybe situations that can be handled slightly different when it comes to funding. Greg, do you want to give some details?
Yeah, there are, Lacey. So, if it's an academic related activity, so academic travel, research travel, undergraduate research types of activities, there are funding mechanisms for students to apply for those resources through SOURCE and through other options. Many of the academic deans have foundation money that they can use for those purposes that are given to them by donors through the foundation at the institution. So there are other avenues for funding, it would depend upon those particular academic deans to decide whether they wanted to open up that pool of funding to students in particular disciplines within their college. And that we can't make that decision for the deans. It's up to each dean to decide how to use the flexible funds that they have in their academic units. But again, that all flows up to the provost from a reporting standpoint. So there may be flexibility there in that mindset, and perhaps that can be a recommendation from this committee to the provost to ask the deans to look at that from a funding standpoint for student travel, if it has a particular academic discipline influence to it. So I know, in the Dean of Student Success Office, the most flexibility I have in funding is through foundation money I have. Most of the foundation money I have is for emergency medical support for students. It's to get the students to a finish line, to finish their degree, or to help a student in a difficult financial situation from one quarter to another, to kind of bridge that so they can continue as a student and they don't have to step out for an academic quarter. So we kind of use the money in student success for student retention, student persistence, and degree completion as much as we can, or direct medical support. So, we don't really have the type of flexibility in our resources to get at what you're talking about, but I think some of the academic deans may.
And I know Lacey just punted that to Greg, but I'm going to now punt one to Lacey on this. I think the other part, to go to what you said, Judy, is when anyone comes in making these requests, I mean, Lacey and her team, they wouldn't just tell them no, there's no funding request. They help to identify and direct them to those other ones, those other options. Isn't that correct, Lacey, in circuit counting?
Yes, that is correct. I also would like to highlight that there's a lot of areas in that base funded area that already do funding. And so it's just a matter of them deploying that funding in the way for clubs and orgs and all of those other things. And we actually have undergrad research in there. And so there is quite a bit of, there's actually more funding opportunities for students at Central than I have ever seen on a campus. So I know it can be a really hard decision for, suspending supplemental, but I will promise that I will work as hard as I possibly can to ensure that the students get advised and, even walk to the department of where they could potentially see what their options are. We don't want to just leave them out just to foundation either. And it's hard because it's case by case. And like Greg was talking about, we can have situations where it can be, a student that's in a critical situation, to, a student just got, an opportunity to speak based off their research paper, and it's everything in the middle. So it is a little case by case, but we will work at trying to make sure that the students are impacted very little with this decision.
Okay, that sounds great. I agree with suspending the budget. I just want to make sure that there's some other avenues that are getting explored for students to redirect.
Are there any more discussions or questions? Seeing none, Joey, do we just move to voting then?
Well, no one has made a motion yet, and so you can't, as the chair, you can entertain. But essentially, we would need someone to motion and then second before we vote.
Okay, well then, can I entertain a motion to vote on suspending supplemental funding then?
Motion to vote on suspending on suspending supplemental funding.
Okay, motion by Judy, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Andrea. All right. Do we need to discuss?
I mean, you would ask if there's any further discussion, just in case there is, it sounds like.
We'll see no further discussion, then we can move to voting. And so all those in favor of suspending the supplemental funding? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not sure about, oh, there's 8, Joey? Okay, so 8. Any opposed? Any abstentions? And I believe motion passes 8-0 or?
801, there's one abstention.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see that. So motion passes 801. Okay, and so should we move on to public comment then?
Yep, I mean, I think before that, I would just say that was a great job. I know these are tough discussions and conversations, and it was our first official deliberation. So threw you all straight into the fire there, but you all did a great job with that. So thank you for that.
Deanna, if I may, I also want to thank this group, I think, for kind of helping us sort this out. It's not the situation we want to be in as an institution where our enrollment declines. We have had the luxury, and S&A has had the luxury of enrollment growth, which has provided the funding for supplementals. And when we don't have growth and we have the opposite direction, it kind of takes that away as an option. So I appreciate your leadership in this, and I appreciate your ability to kind of help us think through that and understand we've got to take a corrective action now so it doesn't get worse later. And I think what you've set in motion and what you've discussed this evening supports the institution moving that direction. So I want to thank you for your diligence on that and your stewardship of being elected and selected leaders that helps us manage these resources. It's an important role for you all to play, and I appreciate you taking the time to have the conversations that you had. So thank you.
Yes, likewise. It's definitely There are definitely some difficult conversations to have, but they are needed, especially for this year. So thank you everyone for being here and asking questions and discussing. So then now we could just move on to, oh, Lacey, did you have something to say? Oh, sorry. I thought I saw your hand. Well, then we can move to second call for public comment if anyone has anything to say. Seeing none, then we can move to adjournment. Can I entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Judy. Seconded by Rehan. All in favor of adjourning the meeting? I believe that's 8. Okay. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Seeing none, motion passes 800 or 900. Is it 8 or 9?
It was 900.
Okay, 900. Thank you, Joey. Yep. Thank you, everyone. Meeting is adjourned.
Have a great week, everyone. Have a great 2 weeks. Happy holidays next week, all.